Hey everyone, I'm in London, in sunny London at the moment actually, but the weather's about to turn, which is a bit of a shame. But firstly, yeah, thanks Sean for the nice intro, and really looking forward to be able to present on Friday in Focus today. And thanks for everyone for giving up your time today, especially those over in Europe where it's eating into your evenings already. So let me just share my screen and we can get started. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Please let me know if not. And I know obviously these sessions are slightly different than the traditional webinars. People with cameras on and able to chime in and ask questions throughout. So please, feel comfortable to do that. Should you need to, there will be opportunities throughout this where I will be pausing and potentially asking the audience here to answer some of my questions as well as me being available to answer yours as well. So without further ado, I can get started. And I'm going to be speaking about PMCF surveys under the MDR today. But firstly, again, with this slightly more informal style, I thought I'd just share a bit more information about myself firstly. So my title is Head of Post-Market Surveys. I work for a company called Purdie Pascoe. We're based in London in the UK. And over the last 6 or 7 years, I've helped deliver over 600 post-market surveys supporting the medical device IVD industries to generate real-world evidence for MDR, IVDR, and global submissions. A few of those photos there, my professional headshot on the left-hand side. A big thank you to Sean and MedTech Lead and Voice for including me in the top 100 last year. The right-hand side, me and some of our team at RAPS. We will be in Lisbon in a month's time at RAPS Convergence and hopefully at a few more conferences throughout this year. So hopefully I can meet some of those on this call today who I haven't face-to-face already. And then the picture at the bottom is our wonderful post-market survey team, which is now 19 people strong. However, that's a bit more about my professional self, a little bit more about me as a person. Outside of being head of post-market surveys, I am a husband, a dad of two, a keen traveller, and a sports fanatic as well. I may have delivered over 600 post-market surveys, but many more nappies and diapers that have been changed over the last 3 years or so. I'm a frequent traveller to my favourite spot, Menorca in the Balearic Islands, and regularly skiing down the French Alps, where I was a few weeks ago. I say sports fanatic, it's mainly football, a bit of golf as well, but a picture at the bottom of my old football team where I was player manager for 5 years, and then an avid Manchester United and AFC Wimbledon fan. And the picture in the middle is me my eldest son at his second game on Monday earlier this week, which was great fun. So how did I get here? My sort of career or start in life sciences began at the University of Bath, where I did natural sciences, a chemistry and pharmacology degree. That was split up by a placement year as an analytical scientist at AstraZeneca before returning back to the University of Bath to finish my master's degree. I then had to embark on my career, thinking about what was going to be next. I briefly flirted with patent law and quickly realized that that wasn't for me, or I wasn't for the many people I was interviewing for, and then kind of fell into healthcare market research and predominantly medtech market research when I joined Purdie Pascoe in 2015. A fresh face myself down there as a graduate with our old logo and branding. And I was working in the market research side for around 3 years. However, an opportunity came my way in 2018 when one of our medtech market research clients passed on our details from their marketing team across their clinical team and wanted to leverage our experience in quantitative surveys, but instead of collecting information to inform marketing decisions, it was to obviously much more focused, help collect clinical data and predominantly PMCF data through PMCF surveys. And I've been leading that team for the last 7.5 years. So that's where we are today, and that's why I'm here talking to you guys about PMCF surveys.
Any questions about diaper changes, skiing, football? or any related topic or PMCF for Marcus before we get started? Okay,
Okay.
I'll let you dive in.
Thanks, Sean. A little bit more just about the company here. I think I've mentioned most of this, especially in the top left. You know, team of 15 people strong, 600 surveys, and we're a full service end-to-end agency. A little bit about our services. We have a GDPR compliant, regulator approved approach. We have in-house programming, in-house medical writing, and in-house quality control to ensure that all the data we provide is one, fully compliant, accurate, and then also especially with the programming, we have real quality and cost efficiency and cost effectiveness as well. And with the 600 surveys we've conducted, the large majority of those have been PMCF focused. There's been, the last few years, a little bit more around sort of wider real world data. When the MDR was around the corner, we started doing some surveys where there was very little guidance, and they were very much more in that sort of general level 8 approach. And that probably lasted for around sort of 2 years, where we saw the majority being in those level 8 surveys. However, over the last 2-3 years, there's a lot more scrutiny on surveys, a lot more guidance as well, and we're seeing a lot more of the sort of high quality level 4 surveys being implemented. And I will focus on those a little bit later in terms of what makes it high quality and how can you best design those. In terms of what we do, I said we're full service. We can help with the planning, the design, the implementation, and then the back end data analysis and reporting as well. But just before I sort of start looking at PMCF surveys in more detail, I think it would be good to start looking at the benefits of sort of real world data versus traditional clinical studies, with real world data being a very hot topic on both sides of the pond at the moment. And I think real world data gives, as it says, real world clinical practice insights outside of those more controlled clinical study conditions, and this allows for many, I guess, benefits or things that can be taken from that. So it can allow you to evaluate a broader range of clinical questions, include populations that maybe are otherwise underrepresented in clinical studies, able to look at longer term outcomes. And we know there are those issues when it comes to full-blown clinical studies, impractical, challenging, and the ethical side of things as well. And what this allows you to do is collect that naturally occurring real world device usage, potentially looking at patient experience data as well, which would all feed into new insights into device performance and safety, which can inform future device modifications, new tech development, and also align with device innovation cycles. And ultimately, what you're looking there is to assess that device risk benefit profile for real world populations. And I'm just going to pick out a quote that was taken from some FDA guidance quite a while ago, but I think it's important, and it chimes with me quite heavily, where analysis of real world data using appropriate methods, which I think is the critical word there, appropriate methods, may in some cases provide similar information with comparable or even superior characteristics to information collected and analyzed through a traditional clinical study. And we're going to be looking at PMCF surveys throughout the rest of this hour. And that falls into that category of real world data as well. Okay, so just a first disclaimer: I've got a few slides here. I promise they'll be the only slides where I'm going to run through MDR documentation and guidance. No one needs me here repeating stuff that is known already or they can find elsewhere. But I think it is important just to set the scene around where PMCF falls into the EU MDR. So, the MDR Article 2 introduces the term post-market clinical follow-up here when it looks at, clinical data and where it can be sourced from, stating that it can be sourced from clinically relevant information coming from the post-market surveillance and in particular post-market clinical follow-up. Annex 3 also mentions that the PMS plan shall cover at least a PMCF plan or at least a justification as to why a PMCF is not applicable. And then under MDR Annex 14 Part B, it states here that PMCF should be understood as a continuous process that is used to update the clinical evaluation. And then there's a few other references listed there at the bottom. and then just some guidance, which I will touch upon some of these later on in the talk today. But good guidance or resources in MedEv, and also relevant MTCG guidance as well. But moving back, sort of again, taking that guidance from Annex 14, I think it's important again to reiterate that MDR considers PMCF as a continuous process that is used to update the clinical evaluation. It doesn't see it as just a one-stop, tick box. So really what it's asking is manufacturers to be much more proactive in assessing the safety and performance of the medical devices continuously throughout their product lifecycle. I've put together this sort of cyclical diagram on the left-hand side, just simplifying it, but also showing that you need to create your PMCF plan, go out and collect your PMCF data, analyze that data and feed it into your PMCF report. And then very importantly is using the learnings or data there to update relevant clinical documentation, such as risk management, design, your PMS plan, and then back into your PMCF plan so it can help inform upcoming cycles of PMCF data collection as well. The objectives there on the right-hand side, with the main objective really being, confirming the safety and performance of the device, but also looking to identify any unknown side effects, any emergent risks, looking at that benefit risk ratio, and also to help identify any possible systematic misuse of off-label usage as well. When it comes to data collection methods, I've listed just a few here, but we've mentioned, clinical studies, clinical investigations, giving you that rigorous data collection, high reliability and control, which can be essential for high-risk devices, or when other methods such as surveys, for example, are insufficient. Maybe there's a lack of preclinical data as well. However, we know that it can be costly, time-consuming, and face feasibility constraints as well. Look at registries. Again, you're getting that robust level of data. It really helps with longitudinal data collection, and again for high-risk devices, particularly implantable devices. They again can be costly, slow, and sometimes misaligned with PMCF objectives, but they can play a crucial role in post-market surveillance by providing that long-term safety and efficacy data. Surveys, which we will focus on today, they give you that flexible, scalable, and case-specific or general usability, depending on the survey approach, data collection method. There is greater regulatory acceptance at the moment, but importantly, only when the methodology is robust and sound. And it can give you that fast, cost-effective data collection tool globally as well. However, we need to be aware that they aren't appropriate for all devices. There are limitations, and it can result in lower level data as well. Other methods I've listed there, complaints, feedback, literature reviews, quicker and cheaper, but, potentially, again, there's lower levels of evidence. So I think it's important to note that, it isn't just one of these. For your device, it might not be, is it a registry or is it a survey? There could be multiple data collection methods that you take on for that device. It's just making sure they're appropriate, well justified, and that methodology, again, is robust and sound. So to sort of walk along a very simplified clinical data decision tree here, firstly, what do you need to collect your clinical data for? Is it PMCF purposes, PMPF if looking at IVDs, or is it wider real-world data? So, label expansion or something like that. Once you've determined what the need is, you need to think about what your approach is. And it could be, one or several of the approaches listed here. If you've got a high-risk device with a lack of preclinical data, clinical study is going to be needed. A longitudinal an implantable device that needs longitudinal data, potentially a registry is needed. But surveys, we're focused on them now. So I'm going to take you along that decision tree if a survey is selected. It's not as simple as going, okay, I'm going to do a survey. Here's 10 questions. Let's send it out and get the data. You really then need to think about what survey approach is appropriate. So is it a high-quality level 4 survey or a more general level 8 survey? And I'll touch upon the differences between the two shortly as well. But again, once that's selected, it's not as simple as just pulling together some questions and sending them out. You need to think about a very thorough, rigorous survey plan or survey protocol that will outline and justify your methodology, look at the design and think about how you're going to implement the survey as well. And then again, this is just listing how it can help. So PMCF surveys, the traditional sense of what we do is, helping manufacturers proactively gather that real world data on the safety and performance of their devices. PMPF similar can be a bit more complex in terms of who are the touch points and who are the actors or the end users that you need to get data from that help and provide real world data on the performance of diagnostic devices. But we are seeing a lot more requests come in as well around wider real world data, such as devices outside Europe for FDA or NMPA submissions or indication and label expansion as well. So I'm going to pause. Firstly, just see if there's any questions on what I've mentioned already, but also it would be great if I could just see, and I'm just going to make sure you guys are all back on my screen and I can see any reactions coming in. But just a show of hands or reaction to any points on who has used or implemented PMCF surveys.
So I asked that in the chat a little bit earlier. Has anyone ever helped conduct a PMCF survey with a client or employer? And we have a number of responses. Yes, I've developed PMCF surveys for class 2 and 2B catheters and have been ongoing discussions with notified body till we reached final approval. Which brings up one of the questions, which was you say in your About Us that you're in partnership with notified bodies. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I'd say we do a lot of work with several notified bodies, webinars like this, for example, but also conferences, and we presented alongside the likes of BSI at many conferences over the last few years. We've also got an article that is about to be published in the JMDR, so the Journal of Medical Device Regulation, later this month. That will be behind a sort of paywall or subscriber wall for a while, but we will hope to have open access where we can share that with the wider community. That's alongside BSI. I will have a QR code later to download some of our previous articles that we have published in that publication. But yeah, really, we have a very sort of strong relationship with several. We've worked with the likes of DMB and TUB as well on other webinars. So yeah, the feedback we have received, I would say the partnership is more so in terms of that sense rather than working directly with them. But we're sort of aligned in terms of the approach that should be taken when it comes to PMCF data collection and particularly survey data collection as well.
Will your slides be available? Can I share them after this?
Yeah, certainly.
And then here's another question. How do you handle different languages when doing PMCF surveys across Europe?
Yeah, so we would always recommend surveying in local language. One thing is, a more general survey to the public, you could probably get away with doing, keeping them in English. But when you're talking about, medical terms and so on, I think it is important to try and ensure that the local languages are used, one for data accuracy and so on. Our platform that we utilize, we can always program the survey usually in English first, get it tested and validated, and then we can get the survey translated. We work with partners that are specialists in medical or healthcare translations, and then we can relatively quickly overlay those translations directly into our survey platform before distributing to the relevant markets as well. The same token, when we get data coming in, we can do back-ended translations on any open-ended responses that come in, but we also make sure that with our outputs, we always provide the open-ended response in the local language and our translations to make sure that there's no issues with incorrect translations or anything like that as well.
So here's an interesting question, which I don't really know the answer to. Has anyone used surveys for a class 3 device that has clinical trial data? Is that even possible? Can you use PMCF surveys for class 3 devices? Marie?
Yeah, we have done. I can see if anyone else got answers there. I've actually got a case study later on, which is an interesting one. It's on a class 3 guide wire, so relatively, simple, well-established device. but is deemed class free. So I think that it was an important point when we look later, when we're trying to define, which levels of survey do you need? You've got that guidance in MDCG 2026 stating that, well-established legacy or legacy devices, especially class free or class three devices must have that minimum level 4 data. So if you're going to go down that approach, you're going to have to justify it, and you're going to have to ensure that it falls under that high quality level 4 survey if appropriate.
Yeah, can I just say something briefly?
Yeah.
To Sean's question, you can use these data for just about, let's put it this way, you can use the data to support safety or clinical performance. Whether or not it's considered substantial or pivotal is another issue. But there's nothing to prevent you from actually using it. The quality level is going to impact how important it is to the particular device and the relevancy in terms of conformance to safety or clinical performance.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. So you want to move forward?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, guys. Really great questions, and hopefully some more to come. But I think, my question is usually here, who's used surveys, and then also, who's had success using surveys. And I ask that question because we still see, going to lots of conferences and presenting at lots of webinars, is there's still mixed opinions and limited success when it comes to surveys. And I think, the main issue we see when there is limited success is a lot of people understand, well, I will talk about and shout about surveys being a cost-effective tool. And I think that is true. But I think lots of people forget about the word effective when they're setting up surveys. They quickly see, it being a cheap option, so they rush to that. So those mixed opinions we hear asking whether surveys are appropriate. I think the simple answer is yes, they are for the right device, and if you can justify it for that device. I'd love to be sat here as a service provider saying you should do a survey for every single one of your devices, but that just isn't appropriate, obviously. So the issue and challenge we see from our experience is those that have limited success, there's sort of one key similarity is that poor and adequate planning at the early stages. So not thinking about whether a survey is appropriate. If it is appropriate, not thinking about how to sort of set up a proper robust protocol with statistical sample sizing, properly defined endpoints and objectives. And then also, even if you design a strong protocol, then designing the questions that just don't align with those objectives that you've set out in the protocol. So you suddenly get data that doesn't align back to what you set out originally. So that's definitely where we see that mixed success. And without that proper planning consideration, a survey which you think is pretty cheap quickly becomes expensive if you need to repeat it or you need to disregard the data you collected from it. So yeah, I mentioned the two different sort of survey approaches and just where does this come from? I've got here the table of the sort of clinical data hierarchy from MDCG 2026 Annex 3. And surveys are mentioned at two of these ranks or levels. So starting with the level 4, it states firstly, outcomes from studies with potential methodological flaws, but where data can still be quantified and acceptably justified. High quality surveys may fall into this category. The one issue is there's nowhere that actually defines what does it mean by a high quality survey. So there's still little guidance out there around that. However, I've just got a little bit of blurb here, just what we sort of see that as meaning, and we'll go into more detail on later slides around what a high quality survey is. But these are going to be used for higher risk devices or those with larger clinical gaps. Again, just to reiterate, in MDCG 2026, it states that those class 3 devices must have that minimum level 4 data. Here, each survey represents one individual patient or case in which the device is used. So you're asking respondents to complete a survey following each usage of the device. They may complete multiple surveys if they've used the device multiple times or for multiple cases. Could be a mix of retrospective and prospective. And it enables you to meet those objectives and endpoints through much more structured data collection. So that if there was an adverse event, for example, that was encountered, you can tie that back to a certain patient age group, for example, or a certain variant of the device. Whereas the level 8 surveys, which I'll touch upon later, are going to give you a much more sort of aggregated, high-level understanding of the data, which doesn't give you that structured, specific data collection. However, they can be more what you're asking, also more expensive in addition as well. So rank 8, it states proactive PMS data such as that derived from surveys. We sort of term these as more general usability or sort of HCP surveys, used for usually for lower risk devices or those that have smaller clinical gaps. Here, each survey represents multiple device usages. So you're asking respondents to recollect information based upon usage across a set time period, which could be the last month, it could be the last 12 months. So it's a one-off survey, it's solely retrospective. And because of that, you get a much lower level of evidence due to that recollective nature. And also the data is going to be much more aggregated in a sense as well. That being said, it is quicker and less burdensome respondents to complete. But definitely something worth considering when you're thinking about a survey is what type of survey is appropriate for your device and can be justified for that. So just again, those of you who did raise your hand and say you worked or implemented surveys, it'd be great if anyone wants to drop in the chat or if anyone wants to speak up just about have there been any obvious challenges when you've been conducting or implementing surveys? Okay. Response rate is coming in. Yeah, lots of people saying that. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, well, as more come in, that's great. Keep going, and I'll try and review them as they come in. But I just, in case no one did answer the question, I went to my favored AI agent at the moment, Claude, just to see what if I asked this question, what came out, and it was quite interesting. So defining a meaningful clinical objective, so more broad generic survey goals rather than anchoring to a specific clinical question, that comes out as one of them. Achieving a representative or sufficient sample, so leading into that response rate, getting the right respondents, enough of them is difficult. Over-reliance on a single site KOL network is definitely something we see manufacturers struggle with as well. Designing questions that generate that defensible data. So I think, again, vague questions that don't tie back to those clinical objectives. So, if that is the case, notified bodies are going to challenge whether that data actually evidences that device performance or safety. Integrating survey outputs into the broader evidence chain. So treating it as a standalone deliverable rather than tying it back to your PMCF plan and wider clinical documentation. And then just making sure that the survey is sort of fully compliant, I guess, around documentation and audit readiness. So, is there a process behind it for, methodology, respondent selection, data handling? Is there an audit trail, validated survey software, those sort of things? So, it was interesting to see what came out when I asked that question. And there are definitely a lot of the challenges that we see on our side as well, or clients come to us querying those. And I think I'm going to try and walk through some best practices on later slides. But that, that response rate one is definitely one that we see a lot of. And I don't know if I touched on it too much later on, but I think it's very important to understand, if you can understand where your user base is. So look at sales. Do you have your own contacts and manufacturer? If you don't, how are we going to identify those users? We work with third parties and these panels or networks of healthcare professionals, which they're signed up for knowledge sharing purposes to these networks or market research surveys, but now more so these post-market surveys. And if we're looking for orthopedic surgeons, for example, in Germany, Spain, and France, we can go to these networks who have them profiled and we can screen them on their inclusion criteria. We can validate their usage of the device and then get them to complete the survey from there. These are people who are willing to and also very comfortable with, taking part in surveys as well. So you see a greater response rate, and it can definitely help further down the line if you don't have those contacts yourself as a manufacturer. Also, you've got to bear in mind, if you do have those contacts as a manufacturer, are they, high volume users? Are they KOLs? Is that going to bias your data as well at the back end? Because one, you're the one reaching out to them. So do they want to report on, negative outcomes? But also, are these just the more experienced users of the device? Is that giving you a representation of, the true usage of the device from both inexperienced users to those KOLs as well? So, yeah, we definitely see a lot of that. And I will move on just because I'm looking at the time, but I know lots of the challenges have come in, and I think I will hopefully touch upon those on the next few slides as well. So just quickly, why to use surveys? They are fast, they are quick, they're cost effective, they are accepted by notified bodies, they're scalable, so you can reach healthcare professionals globally and virtually, enabling that proactive data collection that can also potentially help support wider business decisions as well. I would always say don't turn a PMCF survey into a marketing survey, but especially for the SMEs where you could get additional data that can help feed into other things, then why not ask a couple of extra questions that can help you as a wider business and add value? I think if you look at the alternative methods, you've got that rich, robust data through clinical studies and registries, but they are expensive, they are slow. Literature reviews and general user feedback, low cost and fast, but low level of data. I think surveys really hit a good balance between the two, especially level 4 surveys that can give you that higher level of data while also staying as being relatively quick and cost effective as well. But as I said, it's really important to know their limitations and when not to use them. So lower level of clinical evidence, compared to the other methods I mentioned there, and also noting that those general usability level 8 surveys are not appropriate for clash-free or implantable devices. There is longitudinal data difficulties of surveys, much harder to capture long-term safety and performance data, only really possible for a high-quality survey if certain device criteria are met. For example, follow-ups are performed by the same physician, and they're documented in records, so you can go and collect that data through a survey. It's not suitable for all devices. High-quality surveys must be used for higher-risk devices. Surveys are not appropriate for devices likely with limited pre-market clinical evidence. There's those endpoint statistical challenges we see. You must build your surveys upon endpoints and acceptance criteria. Ideally, statistical sample sizing, feeding off those endpoints and acceptance criteria. But it can be difficult to set these and to collect data to align against these with surveys as well. The potential for bias, there's selection bias, especially if there's manufacturer involvement in the recruitment process, and could potentially then be a lack of representation as well. There's also recall bias, especially with those level 8 surveys that are based solely on recollection. And then feasibility constraints. Recruitment can be challenging, especially for low volume or specialist use devices, and response rates can be low. I think one thing I mentioned there with the panel networks that we use, we also do, in the most part, use incentives to reward people, not reward, but compensate people for their time. We try and keep surveys relatively short, 15, 20 minutes maximum. So the rates aren't crazy when we make sure we work within fair market values, either set by the manufacturer or the going rates in that market as well. So hopefully that, again, looks at some of those challenges that some of you guys may have had. So I guess the question here, again, feel free to add any comments in the chat or jump on, feel free to speak and respond. But has anyone got any ideas of, what makes a high quality PMCF survey?
I'll go. I mean, for me, it's actually answering a question. It's providing real insight into something rather than just performing a survey. One of the things in marketing surveys, for example, they ask questions that they don't really care what the answer is, or they're asked to make the people feel good about themselves. Like, oh, I want to hear compliments, but it's not really driving toward a decision. And since you're specifically trying to support clinical evidence, it's really important that the questions be, few and targeted and going to generate an answer that's going to drive a future decision. Otherwise, you're just asking questions for the sake of asking questions, and that's a waste of everybody's time. That would be my opinion.
Yeah, nice. No, I think that's definitely a critical key point. And I think, similar things have come into the chat as well, well-structured questions that give you that valuable data, ensuring that the questions align with those safety and performance endpoints as well. So I think, validity, reliable data as well. So yeah, they're definitely key points when it comes to those high quality surveys. And I'll just move on to my next slide, which sort of outlines some of those points I think that we just touched upon. But scientific rigor in the design, I think I've mentioned protocol design. It's not just jumping into asking questions. It's thinking about, what notified bodies are wanting to see now is, imagine if you're doing a high quality survey, you're setting it up with a protocol that is very similar to a clinical study protocol. Obviously, where there are differences, because it is a survey versus a study, but you do need to try and think about all of that before jumping straight into it. So having that pre-specified rationale to tie to clinical gaps, having a formal plan and protocol that talks upon that is really critical. Linkage to specific PMCF objectives, which we've just spoken about, those safety and performance endpoints. So you ensure your questions, your data align with robust and clearly justified safety and performance endpoints. They should be pulled from state-of-the-art reviews, any clinical data you have already on the device as well. And then that really ties into that statistical sample size justification. So, calculated utilizing those acceptance criteria and expected rates that are determined from state of the art or information on the device under evaluation. Quality data, validity of data we mentioned, data quality integrity controls, bias has just been mentioned in the chat as well. So making sure that you have proper monitoring and quality checks in place for the data to make sure that you have respondent validation, so who's answering. The people who are actually answering the survey are users of the device, critical. There are limitations to surveys. You can't always be there as they enter the data. So you have to try and think about how do you mitigate all of those risks that go alongside those limitations with a survey. Ensuring, is there a possibility for missing data? If there is, how do you handle that missing data as well? Make sure questions have appropriate clinical context. Level 4 surveys, they can be based upon patient charts or records. It's an area as well. You need to make sure you're following any local regulations and so on. Does it need EC approval? Does it need IRB approval? Can you avoid it by not collecting any patient identifiable information and so on? But also ensure that if you are trying to do a level 4 survey where you need respondents to go back and look at specific information on these cases, is it even possible for that device? Are they recorded, or are you still relying on recollection? On those with physicians completing these surveys, which would again potentially risk that survey being defined as a level 4 survey. Having validated or clinically meaningful instruments. So when I say instruments, sort of this validated survey software, thinking about relevant guidance you need to comply with, ISO 14155 section 7.8.3, CFR 21 part 11, and make sure you build in critical user acceptance testing, and that is documented as well. SurveyMonkey doesn't work. You need to have another tools that are properly validated, and you can sort of justify them and make sure they're audit ready as well. Representative and adequate sampling. So make sure your population reflects the intended use. Also coverage of age populations. If you state that your device can be used for the pediatric population and neonates, do you have data that can feed back to that? And also, you might have different variants or sizes, making sure you've got data across all of those. And then finally, transparent reporting. Your output must report findings honestly, include negative data, include the limitations or any deviations from the protocol as well. So some best practices, sort of looking at quality and quantity, really. So with the article I mentioned that we're just about to publish alongside BSI, one of the quotes which from Breeder Kearney at BSI in that article states that real-world data collected via PMCF activities must be of sufficient quality, so completeness, accuracy, consistency, reproducibility, transparency, and relevancy, and also quantity, and to enable those valid and reliable conclusions regarding the safety and performance to be made. So how can we ensure that there is that quality and quantity? sort of said this a few times now, so I know I'm repeating myself a little bit, but planning and design is critical. A clear survey protocol, list out the device information, objectives, endpoints, acceptance criteria. What's your inclusion criteria? What's your statistical sample sizing, and what is your recruitment plan? And then make sure your survey aligns with that protocol. That recruitment plan, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? What countries are you going to target? Your device might be sold across 20 European markets. Do you really want to go to all of those markets and have translation costs and so on? So, you want to have representation, but you want to make sure it's cost effective as well. And then think about how are you going to get the survey? Your sample size might come out and say you need 200 cases. What happens if you've only sold the device 100 units in the last 2 years? It's not feasible. Similarly, if you need 200 cases, how are you going to get the survey to that amount of respondents? So do you need external support, for example, or can you manage that internally? Validation and quality assurance. So use a validated survey software, have user acceptance testing, and have quality control of the data and respondents. And then also critically, in your protocol, have backup and shortfall plans. List the countries you're going to target, but have an option to expand to other countries. Potentially the US, for example. I know PMCF is an European, you're collecting data for European submission, and European data is the gold standard, but you can justify use outside of Europe, for example, the US, where patient characteristics aren't dissimilar and use of the device shouldn't really differ from, Europe to the US. So you could put that in place. And have flexible quotas as well. So, have target quotas, but if you don't hit them, how can you justify that? And then make sure you elicit deviations in your report. So here it's just saying that article I mentioned. So look out for that article. It is going to be sufficient clinical evidence for medical devices and what the role of post-market real-world data is. We did have an article last year which looks at high-quality surveys. So feel free to download this article. That's open access. You can scan the QR code and it'll be in the slides at a later date that Sean can share and at the end of the presentation as well. But the other article will be published over the next couple of months. Quickly, I know we're sort of like 10, 15 minutes left. So I'm going to quickly just the survey process here, and I want to run through a case study as well. It's that cyclical process. Get your clinical documentation, your CR in place, get your survey plan and protocol designed, survey design, programming, data collection, data processing, reporting, and then make sure it feeds back into those relevant documents. We're usually working on a sort of 3 to 6 month timeline. There's variability in that, mainly due to what is the sample size and how easy it is to recruit the end users. But that's what we're usually trying to work towards. And finally, what do you do with that data once it's collected? So, align it with those endpoints and acceptance criteria via statistical analysis. Review the data for complaints and adverse events. You might need to pass it on to complaints handling. How are you going to do that as well? Is that an ongoing basis as data comes in, or is that at the back end to make sure that there's cross-functional buy-in in terms of when that data comes in, they're ready for it? Feed it into clinical evaluation, risk management, and then also those next rounds of post-market data collection. It's a continuous process, and this data can be reused, or not reused. The survey can be reused, but the data and the learnings from it can help update it for next cycles as well. Okay, just before I move on to this case, I should be able to run through it in about 5 minutes or so. I just want to see if there's any other questions. I know quite a lot have come in, so I might not be able to answer all of them right now in this time, but if there's any ones that people would like me to touch upon, please do feel free to shout.
Privacy, please, if you can do that briefly. If not,
Yeah, no, sure. I think privacy is a critical thing. Obviously, GDPR for one, also patient privacy as well. So, majority of the surveys we're doing are with healthcare professionals based upon cases that they've used a device, obviously in a patient. So, firstly, the thing is the privacy of the healthcare professional to make sure they know what data you need from them. So, we're collecting adverse events. A lot of manufacturers would like to know who it is who's completing the survey. So you might need to collect their information, their name, their contact information. So you need to make sure you very clearly list, or allow them to consent for what information you're collecting from them, firstly, to be compliant with GDPR and so on. When it comes to obviously the further down the line, collecting data on cases, depending on what data you're going to be collecting, that is going to, feed into, do you need informed consent? Do you need IRB approval? Do you need EC approval? We try and set up most of our surveys where we're collecting information on that case, but we're not collecting any information that is going to be patient identifiable. We're minimizing as much information that will be able to identify a patient. If anything, it's age group and gender, but it wouldn't be what is the age of the patient. It would be age ranges to, again, minimize things like that. So there's times where you might need to collect more information. If you do, then that's where you need to start thinking about that approval process. How does that work? Do you need informed consent and so on? And how is that going to be logistically possible? Because that could really impact feasibility and timeframes as well. Okay, and there's one more question came in. How do you assess survey feasibility? Cost issue and send in. Yeah, so feasibility, I guess when we cost, we look at our fixed costs, it's pretty easy. The harder thing is, okay, you need a sample size of 200, but how is that possible? We always ask for as much information as possible from manufacturer. So sales information, we have a good feel for if a device has a certain amount of sales, whether that will allow you to get to the number or not. But also what we're able to do sometimes is do some sort of mini feasibility surveys or pre-surveys. So we can go out to those networks I spoke about and go, okay, let's just go to a subset of them, maybe 100 of them across 4 markets. And, let's send it out to general surgeons who use a specific device, for example, ask them what procedures they perform. Okay, in those procedures, what devices do you use and so on. So we can have a good idea of, in that 100, subset that we've looked at, 20% of the respondents use the device in question. And then we can look at, okay, on the wider panel, what numbers do we have for that specialty? And it gives us a good idea of the numbers we'd be confident of achieving as well. So there's definitely ways that we can help with, looking in feasibility and trying to ensure that we're not, the worst thing is to overpromise and then under-deliver. So that's key. Okay, so finally, just a quick case study. It's that class-free guide wire I mentioned earlier. So, a manufacturer here was looking at collecting robust PMCF data to confirm the ongoing safety and performance. The study was designed to evaluate 2 key endpoints, so procedural success and freedom from adverse events. There was also a challenge that data was required across all available guide wire sizes and age populations to address some clinical evidence gaps that had been identified. So step 1, determination of the survey approach. So what do we need to consider here? Well, let's look at that guidance, MDCG 2027 and 6. Firstly, MDCG 2026, class-free devices must have a minimum level 4 data. And then also, 2027 says that the methodology must be scientifically justified and proportionate to that risk as well and tied to clinical evidence gaps. So because of that guidance, we got a class-free device. We want to do a survey. A level 4 survey was selected as the most appropriate approach. This provides that structured clinician-reported patient-level data where passive surveillance was insufficient and a full clinical investigation was deemed disproportionate. We need to then design a robust survey protocol and questionnaire. Looking at that guidance again, and ISO 14155, you must have a formal protocol, pre-specify things as objectives, endpoints, and then eligibility criteria, sample size justification, and methodology. So we designed a thorough survey protocol, listed out a safety and performance endpoints and the associated acceptance criteria that had been determined through a literature review of the DUE and the SOTA. The performance endpoint was deemed as procedural success, so successful advancements of the guide wire to the target location, an acceptance criteria of greater than 90%, and we were looking at freedom of adverse events with an acceptance criteria of less than 4%, or less than equal to, sorry. The sample size was justified feeding in from that information, so we took the acceptance criteria, we took the expected rate of the device, and looking at the 95% or 90% confidence intervals, what do we need to achieve, what amount of data do we need to achieve to be confident that we're going to fall within that criteria. And the survey was designed to ensure that data was collected to align with these endpoints as well. Validated survey software was utilized. So again, having audit trails, controlled data access, GDPR compliance, user acceptance testing as well to ensure that the survey logic, routing, and question formats are working as they should. and also a balance between having a survey that is also easy to use and understanding for respondents as well. So that validated survey software was used, and user acceptance testing was performed with any changes to the survey formally logged as well. Data collections and sampling, we need to consider the recruitment strategy, as I mentioned, and how we're going to get the survey to the end users. We set minimum quotas for those guide wire sizes and age group populations to ensure that those clinical gaps were met. We targeted high sales markets in France, Germany, Spain, and the US. US was used as supplementation if we struggled in the initial markets, and then we could go to the US afterwards. Benefit there is as well, there's no additional cost because no translations, and also a pretty cheap market to recruit in. We did use the panel network I mentioned, and relevant users were screened to ensure the inclusion criteria were met before completing the survey. The data was collected. We need to analyze the data. It needed to align with the pre-specified statistical analysis plan as per the protocol, and results were collected with procedural success of 95%, exceeding the 90% target, and adverse event rate of 2.5%, falling within that 4% threshold. And also data was a subset. We looked at the sort of cross breaks of age populations and sizes, and there was consistent performance and safety across all age cohorts and device variants. Final thing then was the manufacturer really was to think about, what next. So under the MDR, the findings must feed into the CER, the PMSR, the PSUR, and the SSCP. So the survey findings were incorporated into the CER, confirming the safety and performance across the full intended use. And the structured, protocol-driven, subgroup stratified approach fulfilled obligations and provided a repeatable model for future PMCF cycles. So there's just a sort of simplified case study of how a level 4 survey can be used and the steps you need to consider when doing so. And that takes me to the end just about in time. So thank you very much, everyone, for sticking with me today on a Friday afternoon over here in Europe, and yeah, much appreciated. Here again, feel free to download the article here. I'm happy to answer any questions in the next couple of minutes, but you can also add me on LinkedIn. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, you can scan the QR code here, and I'm available. Yeah, LinkedIn, email, just feel free to drop me a line and so we can jump on a call or discuss further.
Want to connect with the community? Watch the replay and meet people on MLVX.ai